Hi, I'm Glenn Maurer, and this is The Next Step. Today I'm standing in for Bud Booth, who's out with a medical problem, and we hope to have him back soon. So I'll be doing the show for a while and have an interesting guest with me today, Hap Ziegler. Hap is an attorney, or was a practicing attorney and consultant, a man with a considerable amount of litigation experience in the criminal justice system and civil law as well. I think he was a prosecutor back in East Coast somewhere.
Correct.
And he's in Santa Barbara now, and he's sort of a interesting guy with a lot of insight into some oddities of our society. I enjoy getting emails from Hap. Speaking of emails, by the way, on the screen under my name in the course of the show will be my email address. And if you're interested in anything that we say on the show, or want to suggest shows in the future or guests in the future, or have a point to make about something that was done here, please feel free to contact me at that email address, and we can follow it up and see if there's something we can do to make the show more interesting or more on point. Anyway, today I thought what we would talk about is what I guess you'd call the prison industrial complex, which has been brought to our attention specifically in the last couple of years in California by federal litigation, which has gone after the crowding in the California prison system and Governor Brown's response to it. Hap, you have some history on when that began, this litigation?
Yes, nice to be here, Glenn. My recollection is that it started with some mental health patients that were represented, and a suit was filed in 1990. Later, some other health problems and issues in the prisons came up. All of it culminated in federal judges in 2009 ordering that the California penal system reduce the population, or at least make more room for the prison population. That went through the courts, and then sometime in 2011, the Supreme Court upheld the order of the lower court, the Ninth Circuit, and said, yes, California indeed had to have better conditions, that what was happening was cruel and unusual punishment. And so in 2011, our governor, Mr. Brown, had to do something and proceeded at that point to at least a couple times try and delay the implementation, which, as I recall, was supposed to happen by December 31st, 2013.
That's the latest. I think that's the latest. Yeah, he's gotten a couple of delays. Well, I think the point we should be making here, as well as that the California prison system is huge. And yet, as huge as the California prison system is, and as large as it's gotten over the last few years, and as much funding as we've thrown at it, the only thing the federal government is asking, or the federal courts are asking, the thing that they're asking or ordering to be done is to reduce the population, not to its capacity, design capacity, but I think it's 138 or 140% of its design capacity.
That's correct.
So it'd still be 40% more inmates in these prisons than they were designed to handle by the people who built them, allegedly the experts who knew how to build prisons and what the capacity of prisons should be like. So we're talking about a monstrous population of inmates in California, despite the growth in the county jails and others, and it's pretty much that way across the United States.
It is. It is. The United States presently has about 2.3 million people behind bars. That's more than any other country in the world, right, including China. And there's probably another 1 to 2, maybe 3 million that are on parole or on probation.
Yeah.
So we lead the pack, so to speak, in the nations of the world. They have a ratio that they do. We have 751 prisoners for every 100,000 in population. Right. And that's the total population. So if you use the adult population, 1 in every 100 persons is in jail in the United States.
And that's amazing. So we have like a ratio of 751, you mentioned, people in jail, adults and juveniles, in this country for 100,000 people.
That's correct.
European countries, England is 151.
That's correct.
151. Germany is 68. Japan, 63. Russia is 627. It's quite a bit less than ours.
Right.
We think of Russia as being repressive, and China.
Right.
And yet America has this amazing desire or willingness to incarcerate people, and we pass things like three strikes laws and others that come to haunt us later. So what do we attribute this propensity or this willingness to spend huge amounts of money and resources on incarcerating our own kind? Why are we different than the rest of the world?
Well, why are we different? There are several reasons, and different people attribute it to different things. One of the interesting things that I've found is that we aren't the highest in the number of people who are convicted in the world. For instance, for some crimes like assault, robbery, burglary, England and Australia actually find more people guilty
Right.
per population, but they don't give the long sentences that we do.
Right.
And of course, here in California in 1994, we passed the three strikes and you're out. And that just made the prison population mushroom.
Yeah, absolutely. The numbers I've seen on that issue that you just raised is that the thing that makes us a bit different than the other westernized countries of the world is this idea that we're going to keep people, once we've thrown with somebody and thrown them in the scrap heap, we just want them out of sight, sort of permanently. So sentences in the United States are like 3 times longer than they are in Europe, for the same kind of crimes.
I think I've even read 4. Yes.
3 or 4 times longer than they are. So we end up with people in prison, and we have this bizarre situation. Now, California, Governor Brown is saying he's not going to let people out because it's a threat to the community, and they're trying to panic. Fear is one of the motivating factors in this, of course.
It is.
Politicians love to keep us fearful, and recently, since 9/11, terrorism has been the driving force. Back in the 80s and 90s, crime was the driving fear of our society, and politicians made hay of it. That's my view, and I think it's true. But we ended up with these odd things, so that I saw, I think it was in the LA Times today, they're talking about getting people out of prison in California. Brown has got to get down another 10,000 people out. And it mentioned that something like 700 people are still in prison, despite all the reductions that have been made in the last 4 or 5 years as a result of this lawsuit. Over 700 people still in prison who are suffering from diseases that make them essentially immobile. They're either senile or dementia or physically unable to get around, but they're serving sentences that they haven't been served yet. So we have this odd situation where we keep these elderly folks locked up who are no harm to anybody, but at huge cost to taxpayers, $60,000, $70,000 a year per inmate in the state, which I think brings us to another part of this.
Well, you touched on a couple of points that I'd like to comment. First of all, one of the things that some of the learned scholars have commented on is that democracy is part of the problem.
Yes.
And democracy meaning we elect, at least in states, not the federal, we elect our judges and we elect our prosecutors, and people want them to talk as if they're tough on crime, and so they're forced through their representation in the media to add time to people's
I think
incarceration.
I think that's a little too gentle on the politicians. I understand this argument that democracy is the driving force, but it's also the corruption of the politicians, in my opinion, who are willing to do something to be elected that they know not to be right. And I've talked to too many people, politicians and others, politicians and wannabe politicians and judges, who absolutely know that this criminal, this thing of using crime as a political tool is not right. They know better.
Sure.
But they haven't got the willingness, and they will say to stand up to it, and they will point out that if they were to stand up to it, they're afraid that somebody will come at them from the law and order side or the punishment side and beat them.
As we've seen them do, both with Dukakis and then again with the fellow from Arkansas that ran in Democratic.
Well, the first one I remember in that you're right. The first event I remember in my career on that subject was Rose Bird,
Oh, yes.
California,
Of course.
California Chief Justice, who was taken out because she was allegedly against the death penalty. Although in fact it was business interest. We won't get into that here. But anyway, so what we have now is a situation in California where the prisons are really pretty potently powerful. The prisoner guards are one of the most effective and well-paid, effective lobbies in the state of California. They give huge amounts of money to politicians, both sides, but law and order politicians. So, there's that. There's a huge amount of contribution that the politicians would lose because they're well-paid. We have a situation where prison guards are paid. Well, if you look at they're paid $60,000, $80,000 on paper, but with overtime and all the other things they get paid a whole lot more than that. And we have these embarrassments where prison guards have retired with $200,000 retirement pensions at the age of 45 or 55, too young and too soon, with big. So that creates bad situations for the rest of the state workers who don't have those generous benefits and don't have that kind of salary and don't have that kind of income, and their pensions are being threatened. But we have, like I mentioned, these elderly invalid patients. I remember a story a couple years ago where a person was in a bed in San Francisco. An inmate from San Quentin was in a bed in San Francisco because they didn't have facilities at San Quentin to care for him. And they had 2 guards on him 24/7. So every day 6 guards, and every week maybe more because they had to so they were getting overtime pay. They were getting huge amounts of money, and this guy was unable to move. He was comatose in this bed, and the taxpayers were paying maybe $500,000 a year just for the prisoner guards to watch this one inmate.
I read an interesting statistic that the recidivism of people over 30 is, I think, half, or maybe even less than half, for those under 30.
Right.
And certainly, I didn't see any statistics, but I'm guessing that when you get to 50 and 60, it's even less.
Well, as a, my career was as a public defender, and I represented either in myself, hand on hand, or theoretically as a public defender of the county, literally tens of thousands of inmates, of prisoners, of people charged with crimes. And yes, we all know, it's obvious that there's the major crime is for people of the age 18 to 25. But then once they get older, they tend to do it. But the other thing that we need to pay attention to is that crime has not what it was as the politicians have wanted us to believe. The criminal threat was never as great as it was as it was said to be. But it's been going down for decades.
Well, actually, 2 interesting things. One is that violent crimes have been going down, and of course, those are the crimes that most people are concerned about.
And the one that most justify incarceration and restriction.
Correct. So it's interesting, if you take the drug-related cases out, you reduce the prison population by, I think, about 33 or 35%.
Actually, if you take, what the figure I saw was if you take all, over half the inmate population hasn't harmed another human. They're crimes of embezzlement or theft or drugs.
We are the only country, according to one article I read, we are the only country in the world that imprisons people for writing bad checks.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw some data on that in the past, and in the old days, it would have been a joke here to do it too. I mean, it would have been.
Right.
We won't imprison Wall Street bankers for writing bad credit, but we will imprison a local person for writing a bad check. And in fact, each county in the state, just to get off a segue on that, each county in the state had a fund provided by the state of California for the local DAs to put their name on signs around town for the merchants to display, saying, if I'm Tom Snedden or I'm Joe Smith, and I'm the DA, and if you write a bad check at this establishment, we're going to put you in jail. So yeah,
right.
So actually, it was a point of emphasis because of a special lobby. But yes, we do have in this country a nonsensical approach about crime and its punishment, and we do incarcerate a huge number of people who do not commit crimes that are physically threatening to others.
Well, what's interesting is that the prison budget is second only to education, and it's actually a larger budget than all our higher institutions.
And we've a few years ago it actually had gotten excessive. The prison budget had exceeded the state university and the college budget.
It apparently still is. I mean,
Still
from what
is.
I've read, right?
That's right. So is this wonderful? We will spend $50,000 to $70,000 a year, and that's real dollars that we as taxpayers spend to incarcerate one person.
Right.
But we won't spend that money to educate them.
Well, the interesting thing is that the budget is allocated for different parts of the prisoner incarceration, and using the $50,000 number, which I think what I saw was just a little under 50,000. The interesting thing is, only 2,000 of that is for rehabilitation,
Oh,
and except for a very small number, like 10 or 12%, they're all coming back into society.
Two issues, if I might address on that. Number one is that about 10 or 20 years ago, at the height of this, about 20 years ago, at the height of the law and order craze, they changed the California Constitution, I think it was. One of these propositions was passed. I don't think it was Prop 8, I think the three strikes proposition, but I think it was back in that general time, that said the purpose of imprisonment is punishment. Used to say it was rehabilitation and rehabilitation and punishment. They got rid of that. So the primary purpose of incarceration was punishment. So that has become California's ostensible purpose. So the idea that they're punishing people shouldn't be surprising to us, and the fact that they do not spend money on rehabilitation shouldn't be surprising to us, because that's not what they were said they would do. I mean, the voters didn't vote for that, even though most people still believe somewhere in their heart there's some sense of rehabilitation. Number two, rehabilitation is an absurd concept for a prison. You know, if you pardon my phrase, after a few months, rehabilitation is out the window. You're just training them either to be tough and career criminals and live in a new environment of gangs and groups that they can find power with, or not. But I saw this, the only sentences that really were daunting enough to change people's behaviors were short ones. Because once you get into a prison, and I saw this with clients, once you get into a jail or a prison and survive for a few weeks and overcome it and become part of the team, part of the group, part of the system, then you're almost bragging about it. I'm tough, I can do this. But the ones who were in for a week or two came out scared as hell and didn't want to go back.
Another interesting statistic is somebody that ends up serving time, a long period of time, 6 months more, their earning capacity is 40% less statistically, because a lot of employers won't hire them.
Of course not.
Understood why.
And especially in an economy like this, when you have choices.
Sure.
When you have choices. But
sure.
So I think the other thing, though, is the idea that crime is on the rise, or was on the rise. Back when they passed the three strikes law, I remember going out in the community and speaking against it on a forum with prosecutors and others, and trying, I had a big chart I would hold up, and that chart would show that crime had been going down for 5 or 6 years before three strikes. It hadn't gone up. The fear that people had about going outdoors at night and all that was based on false information. But it was going down. It was going down, and nevertheless, people still were fearful. And it's continued to go down since that time. And there's some interesting ideas about why. Some will say it's because of incarceration. But it began long before the incarceration. And in the few states that don't have this intensive incarceration level that we have, it's gone down just as much or more. And in Canada, which doesn't have it, it's gone down.
Well, I have a note on that, Glenn, as a matter of fact. A lot of people say crime's gone down because we put so many people in prison and keep them there. And the Department of Justice did a study from the numbers from 1981 to 1996. And the risk of punishment during that era rose in the United States, whereas it fell in England.
Right.
The crime rate was inversed. So the crime rate did go up during that period in the United States and fell in England. Right. So some professors or experts or warmongers said, there, we've proved our point. But then they said, however, in Canada, crime rose and declined just like it did in the United States, yet the imprisonment rate remained stable through the entire period.
And I think
so there's no correlation.
True as Australia as well, I think, and as I've read. But and the other social phenomena that people aren't noticing, and one that's interesting is who you touched on it earlier about who commits crime, and it's young adult males, ages 14, 15, 16 through maybe late 20s are the high criminal behavior, high risk-taking, adventuresome, troublemaking population. And that and then the other thing to say, and this is going to be controversial for some people, but the other thing to point out is that these are young men who are living in difficult circumstances, minorities or poverty-driven persons. And so one of the correlations that's been done, and has been done for a good many years, and it's pretty heavily documented, is the relationship of Roe v. Wade to crime in America.
Right, I've read that.
And I think this is something that we have to honestly face. The fact of the matter seems almost irrefutable that when women had the option, families had the option of not having children that they weren't prepared to raise and treat well, they started having children they did want. And when they started having children they did want, the crime rate of that group has been going down, and the crime rate in America began to fall almost exactly 17, 18 years after Roe v. Wade, as that population became adult. And it wasn't that population, it was the non-existence of the criminal population. I don't want to say criminal class because it sounds terrible, and that's not what I mean to mean. I'm just saying that a loved child, a child that was wanted and raised properly, is going to be less likely to engage in criminality than a child that was not wanted and raised in bad circumstances. And they've done studies showing that the children who were not wanted and raised with another child that was wanted a few years later and raised have substantially higher criminality rates as well. So these are some of the social things we need to pay attention to, and they have nothing to do with imprisonment.
Well, another interesting thing is, see, I don't think it's my position is it's not minorities and it's not race.
Right.
What it is, it's economic position.
Yes.
And I
And also a welcome and supportive family.
Well, the second part, what I was going to mention is education, and
Right.
at least a minimum level of economic well-being tends to be coupled with a good education, or at least a sufficient education. And so you get this vicious circle where people say, well, what did you expect? That child, the father wasn't around. Why wasn't the father around? And it's not for the normal reason you might hear from Limbach, but it's because there's a 35% chance the father is in jail.
Right.
And so that child has, I don't know what the percent is, a much higher percent of becoming a criminal too,
Right.
fathering a child who doesn't have a father, and so the circle keeps going round and round.
It's a perfect mechanism to feed on itself. But the thing I want to get back to is, so why do we continue to spend money on the prison industrial complex, as I was calling it? And I think it's because, partly it's because, as I mentioned earlier, there's economic interests involved, prison guards being one, the people who build these prisons another.
I think we haven't talked about that. I think this whole movement for private imprisonment
Right.
is a very bad move. We're actually taking a for-profit company and saying, you will make more money if there's more prisoners.
Absolutely.
And all you have to do is look at who gave money when the 3 strikes petition came up, and it was some big contributions from the private prison companies.
Right.
And it's the same thing. I mean, it's partly California, but across the United States, on the borders, you're seeing the same thing for these institutions that hold ICE detained people,
Right.
the immigration people.
Right.
So those immigrants are getting held for not just a couple months; they're getting held for years in these facilities.
Well,
Which is a very similar kind of thing.
Remember
that we're
the
seeing here.
scandal in Pennsylvania, your old stomping ground?
Don't blame it on me. I didn't know the judge.
You weren't there then. That judge, a couple judges, but one in particular, who was getting money from a private juvenile facility for sending juveniles to that facility. The more he sent, the more he was taken care of by this private juvenile jail.
Right. He was getting the marketing cost for the incarceration company.
It was absurd. So people with no criminal record, first-time juveniles, offenders, were being sent off for months at a time. Just disappeared from the community. But that's the temptation, absolutely. And the idea of taking any public functioning system and privatizing it always leads to the probability that there will be abuse.
Well,
Market,
that the goals
marketing,
deviate from the societal goal.
well, that's well said. That the ostensible purpose, which is to rehabilitate and return them to the community or prevent them, is lost because they want to make profit. I mean, as a sort of an analogous aside, I think it's Goldman Sachs is holding aluminum in warehouses. I don't know if you know about this or not.
Yes,
but they've sort of cornered the market on aluminum, and they hold it in their warehouses, so they're making a market in the same product that they're holding, and so they aren't going to let that go until they make more money. And I think that's the same with something as personal as incarceration. There's a profit to be made. There are going to be people trying to make that profit,
Absolutely.
and the social value in doing that is going to be lost.
And you can see how the money perverts the way people act. What's the woman's name? The congressman, she's one of the head Congress ladies in the House from Florida. She was lobbying to get business she was pushing, not lobbying, she's not a lobbyist, she's a representative, to get private prisons into Florida because they gave to her campaign.
Right. Well, it happens. Any lobbyist, any consultant, and I know you're identified here as a consultant.
I'm not a lobbyist.
He's not this kind of consultant. But anyway, yes. So anyway, we as taxpayers have paid a monstrous amount of money, and we fill the state up with prisons, and we're still overcrowded to a point where we can't even get to 140% of capacity, and we have a governor who's threatening sort of states' rights action. Bizarre statements from Governor Brown about how the federal government can't make him do this. What was that old line from law school, where, what was it, Marbury versus Madison? There was the court ordered something, and the executive branch said, well,
that was Marbury versus
Madison. Let him send the troops in to do it. The court has no power to do it unless the federal marshals or something come in. But anyway, we have this weird thing where Jerry Brown is threatening not to comply with a federal court order, which the courts all the way up through the system have found more than compelling. The evidence more than compelling.
That's correct.
When the U.S. Supreme Court, under its present configuration,
that's for sure,
won't hold to have more people in prison and rule that it's cruel and unusual under the circumstances we have done in California, I think you have to take that seriously. So anyway.
Well, what happened? Do we have to sign off now?
Yeah, we're getting close to it, so we maybe finish some of those thoughts another time. But I want to thank Hap for being here today. I remind you about the email address and hope that you will contact us if you have questions. Thanking to Ali Adachek, Juanita Chatham, and Liz Burke, who have been running this show so well, and look forward to doing it again in a few weeks. And Hap, thank you again for coming over and sharing some interesting points.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate it.